Maurizio,
Hey,
welcome to Sans Films.
thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I've been loving this place for decades.
Yeah, man.
Hmm.
I want to ask you, is sound the most important thing to you in music?
Sound as the core. Well, I think music well played. In good music, everything needs to be as important as any other element. So rhythm is important, sound is important, and what else is there? Manuality in playing an instrument. Having said that, it depends on the instrument as well, isn't it? I mean, there are certain instruments where the sound is crucial, like the violin or a saxophone or congas for that matter. They're pretty unforgiving. So sound is the first thing that you need to practice before doing anything else. On a guitar or on a piano, first thing you do is practice scales or get accustomed with a keyboard, with a fretboard or whatever, but know where everything is. But with congas and violin, first thing you need to have a good sound, which means the first 6 months of your training in such an instrument is actually getting a sound.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it is also true for the same family of instrument, the same range of instrument, that say a conga player that is very technically proficient, but has got a bad sound, that's a bad player.
Mm-hmm.
A player who's got a beautiful sound and technically is just mediocre is a good player.
Mm-hmm.
So I would put it like that, yeah.
Because a lot of the kind of sound exploration that you do with your setup, which we'll talk about soon, involves lots of found objects as well as traditional instruments like congas.
Yeah.
And lots of sounds which arise out of the objects themselves, or maybe inspired by nature, or maybe to do with noise. So that's why I wanted to ask you, because I remember just reading recently an interview with Sonny Rollins where he's asked this question. He says, without hesitating, rhythm. He says rhythm is the most important thing for him in music. Fair enough. But as you're a percussionist, I had a sense you'd have a different answer.
Well, what can I add to Sonny Rollins? I mean, the rhythm is important. Yeah, I think I've already answered. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, in terms of your setup, you're playing a solo concert tonight here.
Yeah.
How did you kind of forge or create or invent this setup? And tell me a bit about how you use resonance, how you generate resonance, and how you think about objects resonating.
Well, there's been quite a crucial moment in my evolution as a player as a percussionist, when I decided to limit the amount of sound object and at the same time augmenting the sound palette. And a crucial step in achieving that was to get rid of hardware. As a percussionist, you usually have, you put all your stuff, your cowbells, your wood blocks, your cymbals, whatever, you put them on a stand. And that's it. That's where they live. That's where they are, and you will hit them. You might hit them with different objects, with different mallets, brushes. You might bow them even, hit them with fingers to obtain different sound textures. But this is all you do with them. They're there, and you hit them with something else. The moment you liberate a sound object from this yoke, a world of possibilities opens up. Like because you can hit one object with another object, because you can rub one object against the other.
Sounds great.
Yeah, and what I do. I mean, the focal point of my setup is this big drum, this big Brazilian drum, a surdo, and I use it. I hardly ever hit the skin. I use it as a resonating surface. So, can I make you an example?
Yeah, please.
So you have a cymbal on a stand. This is what you do. You hit the cymbal. You can even bow it.
You know what? While you're speaking about bowing, I just have to tell you that once I was at a contemporary music festival and I saw someone with a t-shirt on which said, "Don't you fucking dare bow that cymbal."
Because that's what they all do, isn't it?
Anyway, so thanks for that.
Yeah, and but if you start putting stuff on top of this, everything, the range of possibilities or what you can do with this instrument increases exponentially. And even bowing becomes a more articulate affair, because if you have it on a stand, that's all you do. You bow it, big deal. Yeah, okay, I mean, it's a sound, it's a nice sound, you can do it once. but if you have this on top of a resonating surface,
yeah.
So it becomes like quite a chunky part of your vocabulary because you can articulate. It becomes one instrument itself. This is a musical instrument with a certain degree of.
It's not fixed in position anymore, right?
No.
There's a parallel with prepared piano. The problem of, once you've kind of prepared it, it's sort of stuck.
That's one thing with the prepared piano.
In a way,
you augment, you enlarge the tonal quality of the piano,
but once you've done it, it's hard for it to be interactive. It's hard to be for it to develop in a spontaneous way, because actually removing the preparation or inserting the preparation becomes challenging, in real time.
So it's almost like the inverse process, isn't it? The prepared piano is almost like the setup on a hardware, on a rack or whatever.
Yeah.
Once it's there, it's there.
Yeah. And so in terms of like the objects, tell me a little bit about those. What complements a traditional instrument like a conga or a surdo in terms of all the other stuff you've brought along?
Well, I'm just gonna play one tune on congas because it's something I started working on recently. Because you see, there's something about improvisation which has always been bugging me. I'm happy. This is the setup I use, but I play a lot of improvised music as well as a lot of other stuff, and this is my setup of choice when I play improvised music with other people. When I play solo, I never improvise on this setup, and the reason being that when you play with other people, you don't have all the responsibility, all the aesthetic and showmanship responsibility onto yourself, and you can let other people play. You can stop playing. It's not all the tension and the attention is on you. And the problem with this setup is that I'm working on different territories and I need to move from one to the other. So if I improvise with other people, I can do that in a natural way. I stop playing, I go somewhere else. I pick up something, another object, and I start articulating. When you play solo, you have to maintain the tension. You cannot drop it for a fraction of a second, because if you do that's it. That's the end of the magic.
Yeah.
So that's always been bugging me, and I thought, man, congas. I've always been envying like a saxophone player, the double bass player, because they can improvise solo, because they're always there. They're always there all the time with the same instrument. Mm-hmm. So you can go from one zone to a completely different zone within that instrument, but you're always there. You don't have to leave it.
Yeah.
So I thought, yes, that's the shit. That's the way out of it. So I'm trying to. I'm still not there. So what I'm gonna play today is partly already organized,
Yeah.
You know, I
mean
know
still
where I'm
not there
going.
in terms of like totally free improvisation.
I'm not
like
there yet,
Mhm.
but that's what I'm aiming at.
I'm sure you'll get there pretty
Well,
soon.
yeah.
And so like, how do you generate content from all these instruments and objects? And then how is it developed after you've generated it?
I usually, what I do when I start experimenting with an instrument, you know, it could be a conventional instrument, or it could be just something that attracted my attention, you know, just, you know, these things, they're not designed as instruments.
Clearly.
Stones, pine cones, you know.
Yeah.
Whenever there is an opportunity for an object to generate a sound, I start spending a lot of time with it. And it doesn't really matter if it is a conventional instrument or if it is an object that is not designed as an instrument. I start spending a lot of time on it and not take anything for granted.
What do you mean by that?
It means in reference to a conventional instrument, it means, okay, I know what I can do with this. I know what can be done with this instrument. I know already. I know what a cymbal is. I know what a triangle is, and I know you can hit it in a certain way. I can play it in a certain way. You know, there is a background to refer to. But what else can I do with it? That's always my question. What else can I do? That's my challenge within myself. And I start trying different things, and of course having this this foundation idea of combining any object with any other object. That's where the paths start to open, and the same thing applies to a non musical object. You know. When you approach something which is, as a percussionist, something that is not designed as a musical instrument, that is not conceived or built as a musical instrument, you're faced with two choices. You can either apply the technique of something that somehow resembles that, you know, you can play a drum kit on a plastic bucket, there's nothing wrong with that. Or the other choice, which is my approach, which is what I do, is to spend a lot of time with that object without taking anything for assumed or granted, and try to, rather than imposing my idea of music into that object, I try to see with time, over time, what kind of music that object suggests to me. So it's almost like pulling out of that object something that has always been inherent in it, but it's never been manifest. Never been manifest.
It's a beautiful.
Never been made manifest.
Sure.
Sorry, pardon my English.
It's a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of goes back to the idea of resonance. I think in order to be able to do that, you have to have, which you clearly do, a kind of some sort of like deep relationship and talent for generating resonance out of objects which are not obviously resonant. You know, like a cymbal is obviously resonant, but a pine cone may not be. But clearly it is if you know how to, once you've spent time with it and, you know, put it under your pillow or whatever.
That's a lifetime experience, because I've always had that. I think, you know, this way of being drawn by object, by the curiosity of what sound I might be able to get out of that. I think that was with me before I even contemplated the idea of being a musician.
Yeah.
I think music came as a way of organizing and giving a meaning to this seminal obsession for me.
Because you were studying architecture when you were younger, right?
Originally, yeah. I'm not an academically trained musician. Yeah. Then obviously the time came when I started studying music, but that's not my academic upbringing. Yeah, I studied architecture.
Yeah.
And interior design.
Okay. So there must be some kind of semi-conscious or subliminal relationships between architecture and music in the way you approach making it. I mean, that might be hard to figure out what it is or articulate, but I'm sure it's there somehow, right?
You know, I'm not sure it is. I mean, one result of having been trained as a visual, not visual artist, but a visual technician, I say,
Mm-hmm.
is that because I like visual art, I like painting, I like sculpture, and I check out visual art a lot, and I love it. So I know what I like, and because I have been taught the means to approach a graphic problem, I know how to. I mean, this is a long story to say that I've always been looking after the visual aspect of my music.
Yeah.
I've done 90% of my record covers. I've done them myself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because it's good fun and I know how to do it, and I know what I want,
Yeah.
and it is complementing my music in a way that it will be much harder if I have to explain it to somebody else.
And this leads me on to something that I've noticed about your work in general, which is that, and this is something I admire a lot in you and many other people who have this balance, this kind of perfect balance between the kind of technical or digital aspect of music making running in parallel with a different type of thinking, and this is very general, but essentially what I'm referring to is brain stuff, thinking about other art forms, conceptual thinking, curiosity in listening, curiosity in visual arts, like you've just said, lots of reading. Like, you're someone where these two things, I'm sure there have been periods in your life where one is sort of taking priority, but essentially like they feel very balanced with you, and that's, I suspect, part of the reason why you're very creative and make such interesting music. When those two things are out of balance, something else happens. We can discuss what that might be. But what would you say about that? Because for me, that's a really, really beautiful and important thing, and I try, and unsuccessfully, but I try to keep those things more or less in balance.
You know, I'm really glad you noticed that. I'm flattered that you noticed that of me, because that's very important for me. It is. I need to not necessarily to compare music to other art forms, but I have a curiosity about all aspects of human intelligence, of creativity, of also science. You know, I like science, and I think maybe it's got to do with the way my brain is wired, because I find it I have a very comparative intelligence. I don't know if such a term exists. Associative intelligence. You know, I can make sense of things only in relation to other things, and I find it much easier to objectify the relationship between two things, rather than the two things separately.
I see.
Singularly.
Yeah.
And
if what your associations are is a multitude of disciplines and art forms, then the whole thing becomes, in relation to music, becomes more interesting, much deeper, right? If your associations. It
informs and constantly feed my music. Yeah, because I can see, I know all the things I'm doing. I know how they relate to other forms of other expressions of human intelligence, and even within music, you know, there are musicians who dedicate their entire life to pretty, you know, more or less, you know, to different extents, to one type of music, one style, and this, of course, is not to say that I'm proficient in many types of music, but I do play many different types of music, and you know, I played a lot of jazz. I played some composed music. I played improvised music. I played a lot of pop, a lot of funk, a lot of Cuban music. That's all part of my musical identity. But I need all these components because they inform each other and they enrich each other. You know, by not being confined in each other, by not being in a closed loop within themselves, there are constantly sources of inspiration for each one of them. I know, you know, I like to improvise, and I play a lot of improvised music, and I consider myself an improviser. And I know a lot of people, which of course I have total respect of, but they only play improvised music. They dedicate their entire life to improvised music.
And when you say improvised music, you mean like completely improvised?
I mean free form music in the tradition, in the British tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And I couldn't do that. I mean, hats off. But I couldn't do that because, especially with the improvised music, even more than with other types of music. I mean, one can play blues all his life, you know, fair enough. But blues has got rules. Improvised music, by definition, hasn't. And so you're in a very fragile terrain when you play improvised music because there's no reference outside of the context of that one and only that one situation where you find yourself improvising in that given moment or evening or whatever. And so I think I would go insane. I would go insane because you lose touch with reality. I would lose touch with reality. So it's almost like, you know, if by definition improvised music, I think improvised music has got some very it's got some very important things in it, you know. It's a very important tool that we have as contemporary humans, and it contains the keys, some of the keys to our progress, to our evolution. But it's by definition a breaking rule affair, a rule breaking affair.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter how many decades it's been going on, it would always be a revolutionary act, you know, which means to me that I need to be very well in touch with the rules so that I know how to break them, so that I have some rules to break. But if I lose touch of that, I'm like a kid roaming free. You know, I
see. So all the other music that you play, Latin American music, funk, all the rest of it, when you come to a situation where there are no rules and you're improvising in a group, all of those musics kind of subliminally provide rules against which to kind of fight or subtly play against, that kind of thing. Yeah,
it's an endless source of ideas.
Right.
Then they can transform. They can take a completely different shape.
Of course,
they don't have to be a neat, traceable reference.
So speaking of improvising, then, like, of course, there are so many modes of improvising, and here you've been speaking about totally free improv, where there's no like source material. Before you mentioned in your setup, not the congas, but the other setup, you basically don't improvise at all, right? That's what you seem to say.
Yeah, when I play solo, yeah.
But I'm not sure I would agree with that completely. Like, of course, there's a one extreme, you might free improvisation. At the other extreme, the most heavily detailed score to read in an orchestra or something like that. That might be the two extremes where there's hardly any improvisation and complete improvisation. But surely your place sits somewhere in between there, because even though you might plan the form and the duration approximately or quite precisely, actually how you go about bouncing your ping pong balls or whatever is improvised.
Well, improvising within a given material, isn't it? I mean, you pointed out the extreme, the other extreme, which is music which is totally written note by note, you know, with even indications of expression, of ritardando, you know. So it's the instruction is as detailed as possible. And obviously my music is not that. But if we stay in the realm of composed music, maybe the closest thing is a graphic score.
Yeah.
But it's not even that vague.
Right.
It's more detailed than a graphic score,
Right,
because
right.
a graphic score will leave a lot of space for interpretation. What I do when I create my pieces of music, if I have to transcribe it as a memo for myself, I do verbal descriptions.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's hardly any notation. But the verbal and a little bit of visual instructions. So it's almost like a roadmap.
Sure.
A set of instructions, you know, turn left here, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever written a manifesto?
Well, you know, that's quite a question, because yeah, as it happens, I did write a few. Yeah.
I thought you might say that.
I did, because I've always had. It's such a 20th century thing, isn't it? And I feel so rooted, so deeply rooted, and I feel such a sense of belonging into the 20th century myself. It feels like, you know, my life is defined by it, and I belong to it. And also historically, I mean, what if you see, if we talk about the last 5 centuries and the moments and the decades we've been living now, it almost seems like everything is converging towards the 20th century, and that during the 20th century, that's when everything is defined. And what we're living now, the last 2 decades, is just a regurgitation of that. And we're most certainly living in a state of decadence now as a global culture, as a civilization. So the manifesto as such is such a, it's so defining of the 20th century, you know, when something like an artistic movement, a current, or any artistic gesture that's got some social structure of any sort was something that happened in the 20th century, you know.
It was always accompanied by a manifesto.
It was always accompanied by a manifesto, you know, and now, for example, you know, in our age, after the 2000, we live in a society which is so dominated by profit and success and popularity, that a lot of people, a lot of artists, they don't even realize that every time they write a press release, they are actually writing their own manifesto. It's just they don't, you know, we don't call it that anymore. But and it hasn't got the same functions. But you know, that is your statement of intentions as an artist, isn't it? It's just it's got different functions.
Written in the third person.
Oh yeah, praising somebody, that you're not, obviously.
Okay.
Because you have to do that before somebody praises you, because otherwise you don't get any attention.
So yeah, I appreciate that's quite a big question, but I also suspected you'd have a good answer. And another big question, and this doesn't have to be difficult necessarily, but it's a tricky subject, but because again of the nature of the way you make music and your relationship with sound and found objects, can you say something about beauty? Because beauty is the notion of beauty in music is still so overwhelmingly important for so many listeners and musicians, that I wondered if you had any personal insight on what that means to you, or whether it's even important.
Let's start talking about beauty in broader terms. Yeah, beauty as a universal concept, because I think that somehow this is something that we all seem to agree on. You know, beauty is beauty. and the degree of appreciation of beauty as such is only affected by how much a certain object of contemplation affects you personally. I mean, fire is beautiful, there's no denying that, but not when your house is on fire. Or a thunderstorm is a beautiful thing, but you might not spend so much time in contemplating that when you're in a boat in open seas. So let's talk about less harmful things, like a tree is beautiful, a mountain is beautiful. There's no discussion of that. A tree is beautiful, a mountain is beautiful, the sky, the ocean is beautiful, and incidentally, all these examples are cases in which there is no effort being made to express or construct beauty. So a healthy tree is beautiful, a sick tree is not so beautiful, because there is some hindrance. The ocean is beautiful. A polluted ocean is not so beautiful, because there is some obstacle to its natural existence. And so now we're narrowing it down to music, or to any form of performing art for that matter. I think that the same applies, when the path of least resistance is applied in playing, for example, or in painting. That's when beauty is undisputably and universally recognized, which tells a lot about how important it is to practice a lot.
I see.
So I think by performing a gesture of any sort hundreds, thousands of times, you make it look so natural. It's almost like you create a groove in the fabric of space-time, and you make it look beautiful. That everybody will recognize beauty there. So so even if a seminal idea is not manifest in the finished musical product, theatrical product, if there are hours and hours and hours of preparation behind it, the output will be recognized by a viewer as beautiful.
Yeah, I think for me it's like, I notice it a lot in like string players. There's something about a violin or any kind of string instrument which really shows up somebody's kind of natural physical relationship with their instrument. Of course you can observe that in congas, piano, whatever, but there's something about bowed string instruments, and I'm just really drawn to musicians who just demonstrate a complete flow in the way they approach their instrument, the way they. So I'm sort of haunted by the fact whether that's just sort of randomly, genetically given to us at birth, or what are the processes of cultivating that through a lifetime.
Well, certainly practicing for thousands of hours will help you to get there, but there are natural predispositions. There's something that I've seen in an interview to Horacio Hernandez, a very, very accomplished Cuban player.
Conga player.
He's a drummer. He's a drum kit player. He was on a symposium together with Giovanni Hidalgo, and they were talking about, they're very proficient players, both of them. And he was talking about, people approaching him and say to him, you have such a, it comes also natural to you, you have such a. It's so easy for you, and he goes, my answer is, that it all comes from practicing, but, spending days and days, 8 hours a day, 5-6 hours a day, a week, practicing and you will get there. My answer is no. Not everybody will get there, because somebody can practice for a whole lifetime assiduously and not get there because they don't have that predisposition, because the nature of the quality of the practicing is also important, and you have to have that clear in your mind. And for some people it's easy to understand what the function of practicing is, and for some people it is not.
Let's talk about Latin music before we wrap it up. You spent lots of time playing Cuban music, probably lots of Brazilian music and all sorts. Do you have anything to say about the kind of swing and the kind of unevenness, you can call it whatever you want, wonkiness that exists in a lot of these music? I'm thinking about, I mean, it's pretty much all over the continent, but like I'm thinking specifically something like rumba or any kind of samba or, you know, stuff like that. Like you've played a lot of it. What can you say about how that's generated?
I think it's a very natural, physical, muscular thing, you know, it's the way our body functions with an instrument. I think I mean, you're asking this question because the other extreme exists, you know, the idea that music can be exact and geometrical and regular.
Well, a lot of us start there and then have to learn how to be wonky.
True.
Which is sort of a weird way around to go, according to what you're saying. Right?
Yeah, true. Well, because a lot of us are white Europeans, isn't it? So we don't have a day-to-day example of that. So it's not naturally part of something that we hear from childhood. Sure. At one point in our life, we start listening to records and say, how does that work? You know, and we start trying to imitate it, and then, it's, you know, I think the idea of music being geometrically precise, exact,
kind of quantized, right?
Quantized, let's call it quantized, but I think it comes before digital recording or MIDI programming.
Yeah,
it's a white European thing. Again, we're going back to the 20th century. I think it's an idea that was planted during the early 20th century when composers of written music started becoming aware of non-European music, Indian music, African music, and they started incorporating that into their musical language. So you had to compromise, you know, the fact that you use a means of artistic expression, which consists in giving precise instructions to a player, to reconcile that with a music that you want to communicate, which is not really transcribable, not so faithfully, you know. So it accommodated within a grid. I think it happened on that stage, you know.
It would be interesting to know whether Stravinsky heard that in the music, whether he heard the unevenness, or whether he heard it as something really strict, which was then communicated in a score to his musicians.
I cannot tell, but you know, of course, you know, written music goes way back before Stravinsky and before the 20th century. But you know, let's say a quintuplet in a Chopin piece of piano music, it just means, you know, you use these 5 notes to go from this point to the next musical episode. This is not, he hasn't got a geometrical rigidity.
Yeah,
meanwhile, a quintuplet in a Stravinsky piece, it's a geometrical mathematical statement, you know. It has to have that duration, it has to have that specific relationship with everything else that is happening. But maybe we're going too far, because if we're talking about that wonkiness, I think that is a very natural thing, you know. If you play a pandeiro, and he obviously swing, because he goes, you know, you ask a pandeiro player, can you play straight? And I would go, you know what? No, I cannot, because, you know, that's the way my body, you know, that's how it is. That's how it is. You can hear that in samba. You can hear that in salsa on a lesser extent, because salsa is a second half of the 20th century hybrid form of music construction.
But in rumba and changui, even though you have a few elements which are very fixed and precise, I mean, it's all precise, but let's say just very fixed. You know, a lot of the improvising drums are just absolutely stretching the music, right? Stretching the beat, stretching the phrasing. Wonky, so unbelievably wonky.
And that is more directly rooted in African music.
Yeah.
Yet again, there can be wrong notes, you know, even there, you know. If you play wrong, you play wrong. There's no dispute.
Yeah.
You know?
You've reached a stage where when you play your solo set, of course all these things inform you, but you don't really play any of them explicitly. They're just there under the surface. Someone who knows what to listen for can hear that you have a kind of command of things like swing. But I would say, like, you know, 90% of, from what I've heard of your gigs before, 90% of your whole show will be unpulsed music, will be music certainly without a meter, without a looping meter, and probably most of the time without even a pulse.
Yeah.
Which is quite a radical thing to do when you're playing, you know, percussion instruments which are defined mostly by their attack. So, like, how would you, you know, and this is an incredible skill, I would say. How would you, like, advise someone who wants to get into playing music that is unmetered, unpulsed, and that kind of floats in space? What would you say to them? Like, how would you advise them where to get inspiration from?
As a percussionist, because obviously as a keyboard player that comes pretty easy, isn't it?
Sure.
Well, it depends about the instrument, but you're asking as a percussionist.
Yeah.
Imitate nature. That's my advice. Imitate nature, because, you know, listen to birds' song. There is no pulse there. Listen to 5 dogs barking simultaneously. Listen to the steel rope clanging on the mast of many docked sailboats on a windy night. Listen to that, and try to understand the musicality of that and replicate that in your music. The raindrops on a corrugated iron roof. So learn that. Don't trust your instinct, because if you trust your instinct, you will fall into a pattern which is suggested by maybe percussion music played out of time that you have heard. Okay, so
lots of bowed cymbals.
Huh?
With lots of bowed
Oh,
cymbals.
yeah. But even if you play a percussive, namely percussive instrument, yeah.
Sure.
What are the examples? What do we have? We have, or what can come as a result of that? What can come instinctive to a young player, for example? What you would do? Okay, so that's a habit.
Sure.
Analyze that. What is it? So you start slow, and then you gradually speed up, and then you slow down again. And simultaneously, you start quiet, and then you go up in amplitude, and then you go, okay, well, that's a habit. So what's the wise thing to do with a habit? Break it. You know, analyze it, and do the exact opposite. For example, you know, that's the starting point. So whenever, you know, a good inquiring mind, a mind prone to self-evolution, to self-advancement, is a mind that spots these habits, these repetitions, these vicious circles that you're trapped, and analyze them and try to break them. So, yeah, again, break not only other people's rules, break your own rules as well. That's the way to go.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank
man.
you,
It's
man.
been great.
Such a pleasure.
I can't wait to hear all of this later and play a little duo together too.
Yeah.
With this.
On the day of your birthday.
Yeah, man.